Welcome to Argument Basics. As we saw last time, an argument consists of the claim to be supported, known as a conclusion, and the evidence offered in support of that conclusion, known as the premises. So when you have an argument, you would want to assess it to see if it's good, bad, or ugly. So when assessing an argument, there are two types of assessment. One general assessment deals with the quality of the reasoning. This is a question about the logic. Is the logic good? The second is a question about the content, about the assessment of the premises, which is the content of the argument good? So this is like assessing, say, cooking or food. And essentially broadly speaking, there's two ways cooking can go good or bad. I mean, there's lots of ways it can go bad, obviously, but in general, we can look at it in the following way. One way cooking can go well or bad is the process of putting together the ingredients. A person could be good at cooking and combine things correctly, putting things in the right order and applying, say, heat correctly. And if this is done well, then it's good cooking. If it's done badly, bad cooking. Now, of course, the skill at cooking, the skill at which one puts things together, and applies heat, etc., that's only half of it, because there's also the question of the quality of ingredients. So a person could be a great cook and put together everything very skillfully, but if they have awful things to work with, terrible ingredients, it's not going to be a very good, meal. So you could have this great cook, and if all they have to work with is, say, slugs and sand and some mud, no matter how you put together slugs and sand and mud, it's gonna be pretty bad. Likewise, someone could be really bad at cooking and they could have great ingredients. They could have, say, if you eat meat, say the finest cuts of steak, or if you're, a vegetarian or vegan, the finest slices of tofu and all these great vegetables and spices, and they could put them together in a horrible way, like set it on fire by accident and, end up with a lump of charcoal. Now, ideally, of course, what you'd want is good cooking and good ingredients, which would give you a good meal. And the worst case, of course, would be terrible cooking and terrible ingredients. So how does this relate back to arguments? Well, arguments are kind of like cooking in the sense that you're putting things together, and there's a question of how well are you putting it together? Are the directions followed correctly? Are they good directions? And the question about the content. So getting into the gist of the arguments, our first general question is this. When we're building an argument or looking at someone else's argument, we'd ask about the reason, about the logic, or metaphorically, again, the cooking. So the question here is, do the premises logically support the conclusion? As I say, does the evidence support the claim being made? Now, this is where arguments split into those two flavors I mentioned in the previous video, deductive versus inductive. So if an argument is deductive, the question is it logically valid or logically invalid? And this always throws people off. This has nothing to do with the actual content. It's a question of the logic. So a valid argument is this. It's an argument such that if all the premises were true, then the conclusion must be true. And this really tends to throw people off because you can have a argument that's valid in which everything is false, which sounds, kind of weird, but again, go back to cooking. A person can be an amazing cook, cooking with, slugs and dirt. Their cooking is incredible. Their skill is great, but they're working with, just mud and dirt and slugs. Now, if the cooking is bad, metaphorically speaking, talking about arguments, we call this, for deductive arguments, invalid. This is an argument that could have all true premises, but the conclusion would be false. It's put together badly. Going back to our cooking, it would be like someone who's bad at cooking. So even if you gave them the finest ingredients, they could produce something awful as a result. So how do we tell when something's valid or invalid? Well, this would take us into pretty much a class on, what's generally considered formal deductive logic. And these involve things like truth tables, Venn diagrams, and proofs. So way beyond the scope of, argument basics. You generally would need like a chunk of a semester to get through this stuff. Now, in the case of inductive arguments, they are either strong or weak. And this comes in degrees. With deductive arguments, it's either one or the other. It's valid or invalid, not both. And there are not like degrees of valid or invalid. It's not like it's a little valid or a lot invalid. It's just either valid or invalid. With strength or weakness with inductive arguments, this comes in degrees. So a strong argument is such that if the premises were true, then the conclusion is likely to be true. How likely? Well, depends on the context. We'll talk more about this in the future. In the case of a weak argument, it's such that if the premises were true, then the conclusion is not likely to be true. It's, weak. Now, again, just like with the deductive arguments, and this tends to like really kind of freak people out a little bit, you could have an argument that's strong, but the premises could all be false. It's good reasoning about, garbage content. And you can have garbage reasoning about good content. Ideally, of course, you want to have good reasoning about good content, just like with cooking. You want good cooking with good ingredients. So that's how you assess arguments in a very general sense. Is the reasoning good? And is the content good? And this works with anything. So whether you're talking about chemistry, metaphysics, religion, politics, assessing any argument comes down to these two questions. Is the reasoning good or not, logically speaking? Is the content, good or not in terms of it being plausible or implausible? So how do you tell when the premises are, plausible or not? Well, if you have a deductive argument and you actually do have it being valid and you have all true premises, then it gets a special name called sound. That's valid plus all true premises. That's the super diamond standard for arguments. It's as good as it gets. With inductive arguments, the special thing for them is what some people call cogent. Not everyone does this, but it's used in a lot of books. And that is a strong inductive argument where the premises are actually all true. So how do you tell when they're true or at least plausible? Well, the main thing is knowing the subject. So this is where expertise really matters. So if a person is a competent expert, they're better at people who lack competence, lack expertise in assessing claims. But how can you do it like in everyday life, even if you're not an expert? Well, in general, this is something that we generally would leave to the experts. But when we're assessing stuff, here are the standards we can use and should be used. So if you have a question, is this premise, is this evidence being offered plausible or not? And here are the 3 tests that everyone can use with differing degrees of success. The first thing is matching it with our own observations. So it may be cases where the premise is something you've observed yourself, and you can, say whether it's plausible or implausible based on your own observations. For example, if there's a question about whether it's possible, say, to bypass the password on a Windows computer, and suppose that's like a premise in an argument, I've observed that being done. I've done it myself. It's surprisingly easy to do. No, not for nefarious purposes. This was done because someone locked themselves out of their computer. They couldn't remember their password, didn't want to erase it, so just did that. And so that would be something where I would know whether a claim is true or false based on my own observations. Now, we must always keep in mind that our observations can be mistaken. We can be misled, we can be wrong, we can be, see things incorrectly. And so our own observations can be mistaken. The second thing is matching things against our background information. These are things that we've learned over the years. And it's kind of our plausibility, test. We get a claim and we judge whether that's BS or not, plausible or implausible. So, for example, if someone were to tell you that penguins are native to Florida and hang out here in Florida, you may not, be an expert on penguins, but you would probably have in your background information that penguins are not native to Florida. Now, with background information, obviously, the more of an expert a person is, the more they know, the more likely it is their background information is correct, and the better this works. Now, we should always keep in mind that our background information can be incorrect. We're wrong about a lot of things, especially things outside of our fields of expertise and knowledge and experience. I know for a fact that I have a lot of false beliefs. How do I know this? Because I get a lot of things wrong. Unfortunately, I don't know which ones are false, because if I did know, I would get rid of them. And like with most people, I find out I'm wrong when something goes, wrong. So this is a good test, but it's obviously not infallible. And especially in cases where we have really strong feelings, we can be, quite wrong because we feel that we know, but we actually don't know. And this is, again, why expertise and knowledge and so forth is important, because it's important to actually know things and be able to make good judgments. So what about cases where we're not experts? What do we do? Well, in that case, we can check our premises, if it matters to us, if it's important enough, against credible sources, essentially sources that have expertise, that are reliable, that are not biased. And as you might imagine today, this can be a nightmare, because in terms of what is considered a credible source, this is often based on how people feel about things, their politics, their ideology, their emotions, as opposed to standards of sort of objective credibility. We'll see more of this in the future when we talk about the argument from authority. But when checking a claim for plausibility, you look at your own observations, keeping in mind you could be observing things incorrectly, your own background information, keeping in mind that we can all be super wrong about stuff, and not surprisingly about the things we feel most strongly about. We can often be the most wrongly about. And lastly, comparing with credible sources. And again, this is a nightmare today because of the whole, fake news, deep fakes, ideology, politics, etc. But in the abstraction, the ideal, we'd want to find a source that is credible and match the claim against that. Next time, we'll go on to more arguments.